be our 26th lecture in total. Thank you all for coming. My name is John Carlton, and I am the organizer of the Frankfort Heritage Week Coalition and the co-organizer of this lecture series. As always, I want to give a big thanks to Paul Sawyer Public Library for hosting us, and to my co-organizer, Adult Services Manager Diane Mahoney, for everything she and her staff do for the lectures and the community. And of course, thanks to the Frankfort Type Board and Cable Tammy for taking these lectures and for hosting them on our YouTube channel. And thanks to the State Journal for always giving us some great additional publicity. As we continue our journey to America 250 next year, we have explored Kentucky's geological and paleontological past and learned about the thriving indigenous nations who lived here long before European settlement. But there are a few moments in history that reveal the tug of war between the lofty ideals and practical governance, quite like these drafts of a constitution. While many voices shaped Kentucky's first constitution, none loom larger than that of Thomas Jefferson. Our speaker today brings fresh scholarship on Jefferson's influence on Kentucky's founding document and how those ideas still echo in our Commonwealth today. And without further ado, please welcome Adult Services Manager Diane Mahoney to introduce today's speaker.
Good afternoon. As John said, my name is Diane Mahoney. I'm the Adult Services Manager here at Paul Sawyer. On behalf of everyone here, I just want to welcome you all out. Thank you for spending this lovely afternoon with us. I know there's a lot going on in Frankfort today, so we're happy that you chose to be here with us. If you have a cell phone on you before we start, if you don't mind to turn that on silent or vibrate, we sure would appreciate it. It is my great honor to introduce today's speaker. Denis Fleming Jr. is a native of Louisville, Kentucky, and come on up.
You got to turn me on here.
Oh, I do, yeah.
Okay,
Okay, all right. A native of Louisville, Kentucky, received his bachelor's degree with distinction from the University of Kentucky, and he is also a graduate of the University of Kentucky College of Law. After receiving his law degree, he practiced law throughout Kentucky with the firm of Barnett and Alasia. Later, he served in Kentucky state government as general counsel to the Economic Development Cabinet under Governors Wallace Wilkinson and Brereton Jones, general counsel to the governor and deputy secretary of the Executive Cabinet under Governor Paul Patton, and chief deputy attorney general under Attorney General Greg Stumbo. In 2004, Fleming was appointed chief of staff to Congressman Ben Chandler.
He's here.
Hello, welcome. In Washington, D.C. with the U.S. House of Representatives. After the 2012 elections, Fleming worked with Almost Family Incorporated, a Kentucky-based home care provider that later merged with LHC Group, where he now works as Senior Vice President and Legislative Counsel. Fleming resides in Washington, D.C. and Miami. Is that still correct? He's all over. He enjoys traveling, running, and has written published book reviews. Thomas Jefferson and the Kentucky Constitution is his first book. Please help me to welcome today Denis Fleming Jr.
I'm so sophisticated here with this thing. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank all of you for coming. Is this a typical crowd for this?
It is.
It looks like you've got a lot of folks. I appreciate all of you coming, and appreciate your interest in the book. If you haven't had a chance to get it, I hope you get it. It's on sale over here at Poor Richards. You can get it in Lexington at Joseph Beth, and it's at all the Barnes and Nobles. But I've gotten to the point, if somebody really wants a copy of the book, you can have one for free. I'll give it to you. I bought a whole bag full of them. So, but thank you for making it. You can't hear?
For some reason, it's not picking.
Do you want to put the microphone up here?
Here we go. Okay.
All right.
It just needs to be a little bit closer to you, I think.
Does that work?
Yeah, let me turn it up.
All right.
How about again?
Hello? Can you hear me? Is that good? Still can't hear?
We may just have to give you a handheld. Sorry.
Put the mic up here. I'll start talking. So, Thomas Jefferson and the Kentucky Constitution. I think if you'd asked me before I wrote this book what I could tell you about Thomas Jefferson, it wasn't a lot. I probably could have remembered He wrote the Declaration of Independence, which he did in 1776 in Philadelphia. And I know I could have told you he was president. And he was president for 2 terms, but he did a heck of a lot more than that. He was a fellow that was interested in constitutions and constitutional constructs and the state and federal constitution. He was always writing statutes and laws. He took a shot at a draft of the Virginia Constitution, which went on for like 40 pages and put an entire criminal code in it. He was an intellect, he was well-read, but he was particularly interested in this notion of separation of powers and how you have distinctions and bright lines between the branches of government. He was focused on trying to get a separation of powers clause in the federal Constitution that he failed to do. And we know that because if you look at the Federalist Papers, you can see Madison wrote an essay in there anonymously for 6.5 pages saying how we didn't need a separation of powers clause in the federal Constitution. It was that critical a deal to him. But he did a lot of things. Let's sort of work back from when he was president, and then we'll back into George Nicholas and John Breckinridge. He was president for 2 terms, 1801 to 1809. Before that, he was vice president under John Adams. That was a tumultuous time, not only in the nation, but in Kentucky. That's when he got all tangled up with Adams on the Alien and Sedition Acts, a portion of which is the Alien Enemies Act that's alive and well today. That's what the president's using to try to deport the illegal aliens. And he fell out big time with Adams. He and Adams had an on-again, off-again friendship. But he was so mad about the Alien and Sedition Acts that he secretly wrote the Kentucky resolutions for Nicholas and Breckinridge that passed over here at the new Capitol before it burned down at the behest of John Breckinridge. And I think that's one of the reasons that Adams went on to lose his election in 1800 and Jefferson beat him. The nation just went crazy over the Alien and Sedition Acts. Kentucky had a big problem with it and passed the resolutions, but these are all things Jefferson's doing behind the scenes. He's writing the Kentucky resolutions that called for Kentucky to nullify the Alien and Sedition Acts. There were riots all over the state. I mean, it was a wild time. We'll get into a little bit more of it here in just a minute. But backing up from that job, he was Secretary of State under George Washington. And then before that, he was Minister to France for 3.5 years. But before all that, and I don't think I could have told you he did this, he was governor of Virginia for 2 one-year terms, 1779 and 1781. Who here knew he was governor of Virginia? Of course, Ben would know. John, did you know? I had no idea. Well, this is where he runs into Nicholas and John Breckinridge. They both start off at the very same year. Nicholas and Breckinridge managed to get themselves elected to the Virginia House of Delegates. And I'll tell you where I came across these characters. See if I can get this thing to work. There's the cover of the book. I kind of like that. We put the new Capitol, of course, that wasn't built until that was built in 1910. There's Monticello, supposedly where this meeting took place between Breckinridge and Nicholas. And there's Jefferson on the left. That was Jefferson's daughter, Martha Jefferson Randolph. That was her favorite portrait of Jefferson. And we lost him for a minute. There he is. You can see his red hair. She liked that portrait, and she liked the sculpture by Houdon of Jefferson. I have that in the front of the book. But the reason that's up there, and that's on the front page of the book, it was done in 1792, and that's the same year he had this meeting that's described in this old Kentucky Supreme Court case that's the genesis of the idea for the whole book. The Kentucky Supreme Court has sort of taken and modified that clause. You can't imagine how many different ways, and it's been used to either defeat or to justify some of the biggest policy reforms Kentucky's ever had. Probably one of the biggest ones was the education case in 1989, where the Kentucky Supreme Court struck down our system of unequal funding for elementary and secondary educations. That was a decision written largely by Bob Stevens, and he would always trot out this clause allegedly written by Jefferson, the separation of powers clauses. But I came across this here in Frankfort when I was general counsel to Governor Patton. I was his general counsel for 8 years. We'd been 6 months into our first term. Pat Abel was sort of coaching me a little bit. He's back there. And we had what began to be a series of skirmishes with the General Assembly over the executive branch's prerogative to issue administrative regulations. They were always trying to come up with ways. We thought it had been solved in LRC versus Brown, which is a big Supreme Court case that sort of cut back on the legislature's ability in the interim between sessions to veto and sort of ding administrative regulations, but we were headed to court again over one of these issues. And Cheryl Snyder was sort of, even at that time and still today, is probably the preeminent legal scholar on the state constitution. We hired him. He had represented Governor Brown in LRC versus Brown. And he did it with Burt Combs. And he showed up to the office. He said, hey, we're going to end up in court over this. I've got a pamphlet I want you to read. He said, I wrote it. It's on the state constitution separation of powers. So I read it, and I called him a couple days later. He said, I kind of like history. You've got this statement in there about Jefferson writing the first two clauses of our Constitution. He goes, well, that's what I think happened. So over the years, that has always been in the back of my mind, and I decided to start to research it a little bit. And his article said that Jefferson wrote the first two clauses of Kentucky's first, second, and third Constitution. It stayed that way all the way through, 1792, 1799, 1850. In 1891, they added our Bill of Rights. We finally got a Bill of Rights in 1891, and those two clauses slipped down to sections 27 and 28. They're pretty simple. I don't want to get too legal on you, but it basically says that the powers of Kentucky's government are vested in the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. That's the first clause. And the second one says, no one branch of government can exercise any of the powers properly belonging to the other. And in support of that, I finally found a few years ago a footnote to this case up here, Commissioners of Sinking Fund versus Georgia. I started reading through the case, and on next to last page, there's this story that a Justice Durrell told about how George Nicholas and John Breckinridge met at Monticello, and Jefferson gave them these clauses that he thought should be in Kentucky's Constitution. So I thought, what are they, who's Nicholas and Breckinridge? Why are they meeting at Monticello? Why does Jefferson even care about it? And the more I unraveled it, it became to be a pretty good story. There I am with Cheryl Snyder, of all people. We're over here in Franklin Circuit Court. Ben Chandler's legal counsel at the time was David Hale. He appeared with us. And we're arguing here over a budget case where we tried to pass a budget by executive order. And it's in there because Cheryl wrote the forward to the book. But that day we're using these clauses about Jefferson that are used all the darn time in all these big cases. And the more I looked at it, I thought this could be an interesting story, perhaps, to try to find out if this actually happened. And it's sort of important for two reasons. One, it's fun history for anybody that likes history. The other is these separation of powers clauses are constantly used in every case you can imagine. Bob Stevens used it 5 times and got to where he told a story about how the clauses got in there. And Nicholas and Breckinridge waited on the presentation of them at the 1792 convention in Danville. I'm not exactly sure that happened just that way, but it began to be some interesting history to me as to how those clauses may have actually gotten in there. And George Nicholas had a lot to do with it. Now, Nicholas, that's up there. That's Wilson Carey Nicholas. That's Nicholas's brother. And he's only up there because everybody says that's what George Nicholas looked like. He was bald, didn't have any hair. He was a big man. He was very heavy and had a very commanding presence and a great voice. But the more I peeled back the layers on this George Nicholas, the more I began to think he's one of the most overlooked Kentuckians I've ever heard of. When you look at his history, what he did not only for Kentucky, but what he did at the Virginia Ratification Convention in 1788 in Richmond, Virginia, or 1787. But in any event, a little bit about, I was saying why it's important. It's important because it's cited all the time, but the court system in Kentucky, particularly Supreme Court and the Court of Appeals recently, has begun to cast doubt on whether Jefferson was involved at all in Kentucky's Constitution. Bill Cooper in the Fletcher budget case had a footnote, and that was a big case. I don't know if anybody remembers that, but the governor was trying to issue a budget through an executive order. Now, that's the prerogative constitutionally of the General Assembly, but the General Assembly didn't want to pass a budget. So this goes all the way to the Supreme Court. These clauses are trotted out again. It said the governor exceeded his authority. It's the legislature's prerogative to pass a budget. And the cases, and these clauses are quoted again. They said this is an unusually forceful separation of powers clause. So this is one of the big reasons we're going to strike down the governor's executive order. And then fast forward to within the last couple of, there's a footnote to that case by Bill Cooper. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of Bill Cooper. He was a judge on the Kentucky Supreme Court. And his footnote said, here we have the court again using Jefferson's clauses. He said, nobody's ever demonstrated Jefferson had any influence on Kentucky's Constitution. So fast forward to a case right now that's on appeal to the Kentucky Supreme Court, Shell versus Bashir. That's a case that's alive and well. If anybody has an interest in this topic, I'd go to that oral argument. I wrote an amicus for it with Cheryl Snyder, and we bring out some of the points in this book. But in that case, the legislature just 7 or 8, 9 months ago passed a bill that gave the Commissioner of Agriculture the ability with the legislature to appoint ex officio members of the Kentucky Fair Board, so the governor challenged it, and the Court of Appeals sided with the governor in a 2-3 decision, using Jefferson's clauses again, saying it's an overreach and a breach of the separation of powers provisions in Kentucky, which are so unique. We're the only state that has one like it. It's not in the federal Constitution. But in a dissent to that case, a judge wrote an over 200-page dissent that deconstructs this whole business of Jefferson and Nicholas as to whether they had anything to do with Kentucky's Constitution. It concluded that the involvement of Jefferson in our Constitution was a hoax, and the judge concluded that Nicholas didn't have anything to do with any particular separation of powers clause. So this case comes down when I'm just getting ready to submit the book, to the publisher. Oh my God. So I added a coda at the end of the book and sort of covered some of the research that I think tends to demonstrate otherwise. I'll go through these things pretty quickly. That's a portrait of John Breckinridge. That's on display up there at the Justice Department in Washington, D.C. There's Isaac Shelby on the right. I'm not sure. He was just in there because I talked about him as being a 2-term governor and his involvement in the Revolutionary War. But let's chat just for a minute about Nicholas. So Nicholas, just before he comes to Kentucky, he's 34 years old, and he gets involved. He's an attorney. He's from Williamsburg. His father was a lawyer. His uncle was a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses and then the House of Delegates. He studies law under George Wythe, who's the preeminent legal scholar of his day. He's the same guy that Jefferson studied under, that John Breckinridge studied under, and one of his last students was Henry Clay, if you can believe it. Wythe lived into his early 80s. So he sort of incubates there in the Virginia political, legal, and sort of the philosophical community of Central Virginia and the Albemarle area near Williamsburg. Marries a young lady from Baltimore, has 8 kids. He's one of 11 kids himself. Everybody had a lot of kids back then. Patrick Henry had 17 kids. We'll get to him in a minute. But he decides to run for the House of Delegates at the age of 24. He gets elected the same year as John Breckinridge gets elected, and he's 20 years old. I started off the book saying Breckinridge violates Virginia's Constitution because it says you have to be 21 when you're elected and sworn in. So they let him slide, and he's a brilliant fellow. This is just things come into my head on this because you've studied it so much. They're completely different people. Physically, the way they look, the way they act in their lives. Breckinridge is incredibly ambitious politically. He does everything. He comes to Kentucky, he becomes Speaker of the House, he's in the House of Delegates. I ran across an excerpt in the diary of George McClay, who's a diarist, who was a senator from Pennsylvania. He's the only person who has a written record of the first Senate of the United States. He has fascinating vignettes, if you ever want to read some interesting history, that hardly anybody ever talks about, what Jefferson looked like, what Washington was like, what it was like to have dinner with him. He references how smart and interesting and attractive John Breckinridge was, who, when he comes to the United States Senate to just pay a visit on the floor, and when he's a member of the House of Delegates at the time. So Nicholas begins to incubate in Central Virginia as a member of the House of Delegates. He gets involved in a society called the Virginia Constitutional Society that Breckinridge joins. Patrick Henry is in it, Daniel Boone, before he comes to Kentucky. And they're all starting to tinker with ways to alter Virginia's Constitution and improve on it. Jefferson writes a new draft. Nicholas is involved in that. So he's already sort of thinking through constitutional structures and getting experienced in that sort of thing. Then he works on a criminal justice bill with Breckinridge that Breckinridge brings to Kentucky. It was our first criminal justice legislation when Breckinridge came to Kentucky in the late 1780s. And he spends a lot of time with Madison and Jefferson. And I noticed within 6 months of when Nicholas gets elected, he moves to Charlottesville. During the Revolutionary War, of all the places Nicholas could have moved, he could have moved to Staunton, Virginia, which was a big city at the time in Virginia where Breckinridge was from. He could have stayed in Williamsburg. He could have moved to Richmond, which was the capital. And you got to be careful what you put in a book, but I sort of got a feeling from the correspondence that he thought he could have a good law practice in Charlottesville, but critically, where he landed was 3.5 miles from Monticello. He bought a house that later became known as Stone Tavern. And Jefferson would have receptions and events there later in life, long after Nicholas died. And then Madison bought it from Nicholas. So there he is, 3.5 miles from Monticello. They're working on a lot of things, dealing with constitutional constructs. Nicholas is starting to really shine as a big star in the House of Delegates. And the next thing I start to notice are a lot of letters between Madison and Nicholas leading up to the Federal Constitutional Convention in 1787 in Philadelphia. The Constitution comes out of that body, and it doesn't mean anything if it didn't ratify it. So it has to be ratified by 9 of the 13 states. And Nicholas and Madison start to write each other, and Madison basically says, hey, will you be my floor general, sort of the marshal at the Virginia Ratification Convention in 1788 in Richmond? He said, if we can't pass this thing, we are sunk. And I'll do the best I can, kind of like I did in Philadelphia, and be a field general behind the scenes. You know, Madison wrote the Virginia plan. He's sort of one of the architects of the Constitution. He said, I'll set up the strategy, I'll come speak, but will you help drive the train for me? He says, all right. He says, but I want you to know, I'm thinking about moving to Kentucky. I'm starting to buy property there. I never saw where Nicholas ever came to Kentucky before he showed up in 1789. But here he is buying property. Nicholas I always have seen as sort of an entrepreneurial fellow that wants to do something different. He can't hold a political job for long. He's in the House of Delegates for 8 years, but he was the U.S. attorney here in Kentucky, then he was attorney general. Each time he just quit after a year. He'd write his brother. He said, the politics in Kentucky are so hot, I can't stand it. And his brother wrote back, he said, well, you just went through a bunch of politics in Virginia. Why is it bothering you now? And he says, well, I've about had it. I don't want to have another office, another job. Unlike Breckinridge, who wants to do everything. You know, Breckinridge became the United States Attorney General. He negotiated the Louisiana Purchase. He's the Attorney General of the United States when he dies. Over here in what's now the Castleton Farm property, he had tuberculosis. But Nicholas gets all wrapped up in the strategy for the Virginia Ratification Convention. So they all show up and they have a 3-week battle in Richmond, Virginia, and the whole thing turns on the Kentucky delegation. Nicholas, leading up to this convention, is writing him. He said, listen, we're going to have trouble with Patrick Henry. Everybody in Kentucky, they're only going to send 14 delegates, and there's going to be 170 total. But if we can't satisfy Kentucky's concerns about navigation on the Mississippi and their concerns about safety and provide them some military assurances, because we were worried about incursions from Native Americans. At the time, there were some big battles up in the Northwest Territories and what's now Illinois, Ohio, Northwest Indiana. And Washington had to send some troops out. He said, if we can't fix those problems, Kentucky's not going to be with us. And Madison wrote him back and he said, well, it's so tight, we got to have Kentucky. So he said, Nicholas writes him, they have 6 letters exchanged leading up to convention. He says, give me your best arguments that I can use on the floor. And Madison writes them all out. So comes time for the convention. Madison is there. Within 2 days, Madison has a nervous breakdown. He writes George Washington, he said, my nerves are stretched to the end. He said, I can barely stand the tension. Henry is determined to completely tank the Constitution. Now, Patrick Henry, we all remember, give me liberty or give me death. Ben Chandler had gave me some interesting ideas about Patrick Henry, which makes me want to write a second book just on the Virginia Constitutional Ratification Convention and George Nicholas, because it's so fascinating. But Henry was basically a secessionist. Madison himself, the first week of the convention, writes George Washington. He writes Washington twice a week because it's a big deal. Jefferson's over in France, as minister to France. He can't get involved, but he's writing letters to get there 4 or 5 weeks later. And Washington is at Mount Vernon. Now, Washington's the big deal. Everybody knows he's going to be president. He said, this thing is the closest thing I've ever seen. He called it the most ticklish affair you can imagine. And the whole thing is going to turn on Kentucky. It's exactly the way he said it. The whole thing turns on the Kentucky delegation. They're sending 14 people, and most of them in central Kentucky are against the Constitution. They're mad and horrid about trying to get military protection and navigation, and they want a Bill of Rights. If we can't get a Bill of Rights, they all wanted to make the thing conditional and see how the other states go. So Nicholas shows up the first day of the Virginia Ratification Convention. He gets in an argument with Patrick Henry on the floor. And you can find the transcripts. It's fascinating to see it. There's a fellow that took notes who Henry objected to, but he ended up publishing it anyway. And within 10 minutes of the first day, Nicholas and Henry are in an argument over who should be the note taker. Henry says the guy is a Federalist, and we're anti-Federalists, and we want to pick somebody else. Let's delay the convention. And they couldn't delay it because the Virginia House of Delegates was going to meet at the end of the month. Things were going to move forward. New York wanted to consider the Constitution. And if you couldn't get Virginia, which was the home of the founders, it was the economic engine of the colonies, it had the most population, it had Kentucky and what is now West Virginia, he said, we're sunk. And so the first week is pretty fractious, and they go into the second week, and Nicholas tells Madison, we're in trouble. We still don't have Kentucky where it needs to be. And Madison writes Washington, says, I've got some bad news. He said, I think this thing's falling apart. He essentially says the wheels have come apart. He said, the only guy that can pull it out is Nicholas. He says, I'm counting on Nicholas. He's my vote counter. He's a great speaker. Edmund Randolph was helping him. He said, but we're going to maybe get through it. He said, you got to be prepared for it to just go down the tube. So this is one of only 2 times Washington writes him back. He says, well, we got to figure it out. You got to make it work. What does Kentucky need? So this is sort of an excerpt from a speech that's the penultimate day. I have June 1788. It was actually June 25. It was the day of the vote. And Nicholas gave every argument he could think of. And he probably is the third most person that talked the most at the convention. And he's taken on Patrick Henry. Remember, Nicholas is 34 years old. Patrick Henry is 55. He'd been governor of Virginia. He was he was a literal icon. Everybody kind of liked him up to this point. But he was arguing very strongly toward the end of the thing that we need to have a federation of states. This Constitution won't work. I don't like the idea of the judiciary. They didn't want an independent judiciary because they didn't trust decisions made by the federal, by what could be a federal judiciary as far as their property rights go. And this is an excerpt from Nicholas's speech. He goes on and talks forever about it. But he says, Kentucky can expect support alone from a strong, efficient government which can command the resources of the Union when necessary. That country, Kentucky, he calls it a country, contains all my wishes and prospects. This is where my property, it should say is, and where I intended to reside. This union will secure Kentucky's happiness and liberty. He goes on with his arguments about military protection, Mississippi, and who does he trot out and introduce for the final speech at the Ratification Convention? None other than George Wythe, the very guy who Jefferson, in his autobiography that he wrote a year before he died, starts out saying, the most important person in my life was George Wythe. He was the main guy. So Wythe, I've read that speech, and it couldn't have been more than 15 minutes. But it's some powerful language, and everybody else is literally talking for 2 to 3 hours. Henry gave one speech that lasted 7 hours. You can go through it must have been 40 pages of the transcript. So George Wythe gives his speech. They finally take the vote. The day before, Madison had written, Washington says it's still 80-80. We don't know what Kentucky is going to do. Nicholas manages to pull off 4 votes from the Kentucky delegation, and Edmund Randolph comes up with some votes from the counties west of the Alleghenies in what is now West Virginia. The thing passes 89 to 79. Nicholas is a hero. Within a couple of weeks, he's writing Madison, and he's saying, hey, Kentucky wants me to help them with their first constitution. Do you have any ideas? And he says, sure. And so he writes him back an essay of about 80 pages that I found in the Nicholas papers that I ran by some handwriting folks up at the University of Princeton. They said it's definitely, in their opinion, Madison's handwriting. And he says something to Madison that's curious. He says, I'm working from Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia. And that was a clue to me to start looking around for his notes on the state of Virginia and see what's in it and match up what I could find in the Nicholas papers. So this is not in the book. I almost put it in there, but you can't read it. When you reproduce it, it looks impossible to read right now. But the top of it, that's Nicholas's handwriting. It's also not dated, so that worried me. You don't want to put anything in a book where the last thing you want to do is be called out on something, if you can avoid it. But my best guess is this is the draft of his speech, his inaugural speech at the Kentucky Constitutional Convention in 1792 in Danville. Nicholas had moved to Kentucky in 1789, bought a bunch of property, bought property around Danville. In the Lexington area, he ended up buying 16,000 acres. And because of his friendship with the Kentuckians and how much they respected him at the Virginia Constitutional Ratification Convention, he is appointed chair of the committee and essentially shows up with a constitution that he'd already prepared. And this, I think, is his opening remarks. And it's interesting to see what he says. Twice, he references this business of separation of powers. Let them by solemn and deliberate delegate such powers to the 3 departments as are necessary for the preservation of their rights. Then down at the bottom, let the Constitution therefore limit their power, assign each department its appropriate duty, and prevent either from infringing upon the rights of the people or invading the province of the others. Well, that's the clause right there. The courts say Nicholas didn't have anything to do with. He basically verbalizes it in his opening speech and then later puts it in the Constitution. And I think essentially what he does is take what was in the Virginia Constitution and bifurcate it and emphasize it. I think because of the influence of Madison and Jefferson and all them banging around with him saying this is a big deal. Why this is a big deal it mystifies me, but you've got to put yourself in their shoes back in 1792, coming right off a 7-year revolution. It was rough, and the British monarchy. I mean, they wanted to make sure we don't want to make the same mistake. We want to make sure there are bright line distinctions between these branches. We want an independent judiciary. We don't want an executive that's too powerful. So I was 2/3 of the way finished with this book, and a friend of mine, J. David Niehaus, who's sort of an amateur historian, but a lawyer, he argued the Batson case on jury selection for the U.S. Supreme Court, called, and he's one of 3 or 4 people I showed a manuscript to. And he said, you need to keep looking on Nicholas some more. I said, well, I found everything I can find on him. I found all sorts of letters. He said, no, keep digging. So I found one night when I was down in Florida, about 1 in the morning, literally, a link and a reference to the papers of George Nicholas at the University of Chicago. They'd just been digitized. They're not translated, but they're up there at the University of Chicago, and they were put online in 2017. They've been around. They were collected by Reuben Durrett, who is the principal founder of the Filson Historical Society in Louisville. He went around Kentucky in the late 1800s collecting letters and historical documents. He got a hold of the paper somehow of George Nicholas. He had a stroke in 1914. He was about to donate the papers to the Filson Club, allegedly had a falling out with the board of the Filson Club, and they decided to sell them. And they put it up. They wanted $45,000 originally for the papers. And the family ended up selling them for $28,000, which I figure is about $550,000 today. But the only person I've ever found that actually referenced these papers, but not in the context that I have in the book, is Lowell Harrison. In his 2 places, in his book on the Kentucky Constitution and his history book they did with James Clotter in 1997, in a footnote, he references the papers of George Nicholas at the University of Chicago. Harrison had to have driven up there to look at the darn things. But he never, from what I could see, he nor anyone else has sort of picked out this little thing that began to interest me at the bottom of these essays that were in the papers, where you can see Jefferson 195 down at the beginning. And I looked through these papers, and I spent hours over several days, and I kept noticing where Nicholas would write Jefferson's name with a number next to it. Well, these are long essays on separation of powers, about what will happen if we don't have an independent judiciary, and what will happen if we don't have a governor that has some checks on him, if the legislature runs wild. We need to have a distinct separation of powers clause in here. And here's my support for it. He writes down Jefferson 195. Now, this turns out to be the handwriting of Madison with interlineations by Nicholas. It's from a box that says speech before Kentucky's 1792 Constitutional Convention in Danville. Other boxes say my notes for the Constitutional Convention, and others will say checks and balances. So I finally called the University of Chicago. I said, can I have permission to use these? I'm about done with the book and I want to use them. They said, sure. I said, do you have any idea what Nicholas is doing here in Madison with Jefferson? They said, well, they're references to pages from Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia, where he has a 21-page essay on why separation of powers clauses need to be in state constitutions and why I put one in the Virginia Constitution. I said, you're kidding me. I said, what's the number to reference? She says, well, the 195 is a citation. That references the pages from Jefferson's Notes in the State of Virginia. I said, well, how do you know that? They said, well, we have the copies in his papers. I'll send you a picture of it. So there's a picture of page 195, and you can kind of read, he's given a history of separation of powers for this reasons, which passed the ordinance of government, laid its foundation on this basis that the legislative, executive, judicial departments should be separate and distinct. No person should execute the powers of more than one of them at the same time, but no barrier was provided between the several powers. He's talking about the colonial constitution that they despised, that they wanted to get rid of, that was done by the House of Burgesses. So I kept looking through and found a bunch more references in Madison's handwriting to Jefferson, and then I began to see in Nicholas's own handwriting where he is mentioning Jefferson and referencing the same thing, except he uses a different number. I couldn't figure it out, and I said, well, what's his number? He kept using Jefferson 127 or something. They said, oh, those are the same pages from the Notes in the State of Virginia. There are two editions that Nicholas had in his papers from 1787 and 1788. So I thought, my God, that needs to be in the book. That seems like a pretty big deal. So I told my publisher, they said, well, let's reproduce some of the excerpts and let's put it in there. So we ended up putting that in the book. I think you fixed it here. I'll start to run through. Oh, I can go through. There we are. This is in Nicholas's handwriting. You can see he's referencing Jefferson 127.7. I'll keep running through some of them. There's another one. There's Jefferson down at the bottom. And this is an excerpt from that very first page on what he was saying. Such a government where powers are mixed. This is Madison writing, and he puts a Jefferson citation down at the beginning. Here's another one in Nicholas's handwriting where he's talking about legislative powers can't be too excessive. That I put in there to just show you that's a sign letter from Nicholas to Jefferson, to show you that, I'm not a handwriting expert, but it sure as heck looks like Jefferson's handwriting. So here's Nicholas's handwriting. So here's the product. This was printed in Lexington by John Bradford. He was the editor and publisher of the Kentucky Gazette. This was a copy at the National Archives in D.C. in the Madison papers. He sent a copy. The first person he sent it to was Madison and Jefferson. And you can see the first two clauses of Kentucky's first constitution are exactly the way Nicholas wanted them to be. And he spent so much time on. There's section 2, the one that Bob Stevens and everybody keeps using all the time that's being right now on appeal. It's one of the central issues in Shell versus Bashir. That's where it started. Now, if you're interested in Kentucky history, there it is. That's the start of Kentucky, this sort of stuff. And Nicholas is a guy that I think is underrated and just nobody ever pays any attention to him. Well, he's fighting tooth and nail for all this stuff. And it started when he was in Virginia. So what does all this mean? I don't want to get off of too much of it, but it was a heck of a battle. These clauses were a big deal. I have something down the bottom. Would a separation of powers clause have mattered as Jefferson preferred or been mere words on parchment? Madison didn't like the whole idea. He wrote, as I mentioned, 6.5 pages from they're in the Federalist Papers, and mentions Jefferson by name. He said, Jefferson's wrong. It doesn't matter. Who cares if you have a separation of powers clause? It'll have no effect. And Jefferson said, no, I think the courts will use it to protect one branch from the other. And that's exactly what Nicholas argued from all those notes. I'm not going to go through it, but there's a lot of stuff where he just bending himself sideways to make sure this clause is in there. Madison concludes his essay there in the Federalist Papers that they're just words on parchment. And I always wondered what it would matter if such a clause had been in the federal Constitution. Kentucky sure thought it was a big deal. It was used repeatedly. It's been used to this day to try to protect our interests and try to invalidate things like the education bill. But it was something that has some influence today, and I wonder, I mentioned a couple of cases up there and some current things. For example, President Trump's executive orders. Is that an infringement upon separation of powers to make the FEC, the SEC, and the FCC run all their regulations by him? Those are independent bodies created by Congress to have balanced Republican and Democratic members. There's a huge case, and this gets into some of the legalese things. There's two big cases, Loper-Bright and Jercasey. Loper-Bright rolled back what's called Chevron deference. That's 40 years of case law that says that the judiciary should defer to the interpretations of administrative bodies. And they said, no, The Supreme Court said that's not true. The court system is independent. They should make their own independent judgment. The executive's gone too far. And then you've got the Jercasey case, which nobody ever talks about, but that was a big deal in the Roberts court just before President Trump took office. And that was a fellow that had been caught for insider trading and got a $350,000 fine placed on him. And he challenged the whole adjudicatory process of the SEC that slapped the fine on him and said, there's no statutory basis for this. You're making up an adjudicatory process. And the court agreed. They said it was an infringement on the Article III powers of the federal judiciary. So it'll be interesting to see, for those of you interested in how Shell versus Bashir comes out. Wrote an amicus, told them all the stuff about the book. It was interesting that the Commissioner of Agriculture's attorney chose not to address the amicus in the brief they just filed 2 days ago. It's not brought up, so whether it'll be a factor in the case or not, I don't know, but it's interesting. So we'll move on real briefly to the Alien and Sedition Acts. These are 2 pages from the Kentucky Gazette. The Kentucky Gazette was like the New York Times of Kentucky back then. There weren't any other papers that I've been. Were there any other papers you were? I think there was another one starting in Lexington. Louisville had started one. And the reason I put these chapters in the book on the Alien and Sedition Acts was to show some continuity within a few years of Breckinridge and Nicholas working together on the Kentucky resolutions. The Alien and Sedition Acts were a big deal. They were federal laws passed by Congress in reaction to what was a developing war with France. France had begun to attack some of our shipping interests in the Caribbean. There were a series of naval engagements. We had taken the position that we weren't sure we wanted to repay the loan that France had made to us because it was a lot of money. Our budget at the time was $23 million. We owed them about $3 million. And we had signed a treaty called the Jay Treaty, which gave the United States certain prerogatives of navigation on the oceans. Well, France didn't like this because they had really started to fall out with England. And of course, they ended up in the Napoleonic Empire having quite a battle. And in this climate, President Adams sent a delegation to France to try to negotiate a new payment plan, basically, for the $3 million indebtedness. And they showed up, and before we could even meet with the French delegation, they told our delegation, which was a pretty high-powered one, it was Robert Livingston, that's the fellow that wrote that speech that's in the front page of the Kentucky Gazette, James Monroe, and John Marshall, who became the first Chief Justice. And they said, well, before we can even talk, we want $1 million commitment from you. They said, well, we're not going to do that. I don't have the authority to do that. So they came all the way back over, told John Adams. Adams and the High Federalists, this is a faction with Alexander Hamilton and some others, they want to put the nation on a war footing. Congress passes a national property tax, if you can believe it. The country goes bonkers. Imagine that today. All of a sudden, and they wanted to fund an army. He wanted to create a 20,000-person army, a new navy, and prepare for war with France. And a part of this process was passage of the Alien Sedition Acts, which called for, it criminalized criticism of the president, which Adams didn't like. It said if you want to be a citizen, you have to be in the country for 15 years. It can't be 4 years anymore. And it called for the deportation of illegal aliens. Now, a portion of the Alien Sedition Acts is the Alien Enemies Act, which calls for the deportation of illegal aliens that have committed a predatory offense or engaged in an invasion. This is exactly the clause that's right now on appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. The District Court in Texas, Court of Appeals in New Orleans, ruled 2-1 that use of the Alien Enemies Act was unconstitutional. So the point of these pieces in the book are to show continuity of Nicholas and Breckinridge because they worked together with Jefferson, and they went and met with Jefferson at Monticello. And I sometimes think that opening excerpt might be a conflation or mistake for what we know happened later when they did go meet with Jefferson on the Alien and Sedition Acts. And he secretly drafted the Kentucky resolutions and said, hey, I'm going to get this passed through Madison in Virginia. Do you think you can pass this in Kentucky? And of course, they were all his proteges. He said, sure. He said, everybody in Kentucky's up in arms about this. And I began to wonder, why is this such a big deal in Kentucky? Because all the other states were for it. And the word was getting out, Kentucky didn't like the Alien and Sedition Acts. And if people in New Hampshire wrote articles, they said, well, they're committing treason. They ought to be their own darn state. That's what they wanted to do at the ratification convention anyway. And where Nicholas and others have made an argument about taxation, said if we're our own state, you ought to, if you're really interested in this sort of stuff, you can read his debate. He says, he talks to the Kentuckians at the Virginia Ratification Convention. He said, are we going to create our own Navy on the Ohio? We're going to have our own military? We're going to get taxed to hell by everybody, including Spain? You know, we need to be a part of the Union. But as far as Kentucky goes, we had a riot. It turned into a riot over in Lexington. 5,000 people showed up, and that's the second page of one of the editions in 1798 of the Kentucky Gazette. Down at the bottom, it says Lexington. You can barely read it. It's pretty foggy. But it says 5,000 people showed up at this rally. George Nicholas, one of the last things he did, got up and gave a speech against the Alien Sedition Acts. And somebody jumped up on the stage and knocked him over. And he was a huge, large man. And he died within 4 months. Henry Clay gave a speech, and he got in a fist fight on the podium with some anti-federalists. It was the biggest mess you've ever seen. And the rally went on for 4 or 5 hours. So I looked at the census to see how many people were in Fayette County in 1800. It was 14,000 people was the census. So anytime you can turn out a third of the community for a rally, it's a pretty darn big deal. And Henry Clay apparently there are all some contemporary accounts about who this Henry Clay was. He's about 23. He was an intern at the time for John Breckinridge. He was working in John Breckinridge's law office in Lexington when all this happened. So I also started to wonder what else about Kentucky and about the Alien Sedition Acts? They were perceived as being aimed also, not only at the French, but at the Scotch-Irish. And we have a lot of ancestors, a lot of folks in Kentucky that were Scotch-Irish that settled particularly central Kentucky, more so Germans in northern and in Louisville. But they were perceived as being targets for deportation. And a lot of the folks that had gotten to Kentucky hadn't been there very long. And when you look at the place names in Kentucky, Paris is the county seat of Bourbon County. Fayette County is named after Lafayette. LaGrange is the name of Lafayette's estate, where he lived in France. Versailles. There are all sorts of French place names and affinities for the French. When you scroll through the Kentucky Gazette, the front page, for about 3 or 4 years, beginning in 1780, whenever they started publishing in 84, it had a column that said, "What's the news from France?" It would tell you everything about what's going on in France, not the UK or Germany. So it began to make sense. I tried to bring some of this out. You don't know for sure. You don't want to be like, David McCullough always said, the worst historians are ones that impose history on the actors, that make it up. He said, you want the people to talk for themselves. So that's why I tried to put so many of the Nicholas papers in there and let Nicholas talk himself about it. I think that's the best way to demonstrate it. But the Alien Sedition Acts ended up fading away. They essentially weren't enforced. There are a number of people that actually left the country. There was another round of riots. We passed the Kentucky resolutions. Breckinridge at the time was the floor leader. He was the House Speaker. He got it done. Shortly thereafter, Breckinridge becomes the first U.S. Senator. He's not the first U.S. Senator because first U.S. Senator is John Brown. His house is over here. But he ends up going to Washington, working with Jefferson on the Louisiana Purchase, becomes Attorney General, and Breckinridge goes on to attend the 1799 Kentucky Constitution, which was a big deal, right over here in the same old Capitol building that's now since burnt down. He gives a 2-hour speech, and 4 days later, he has a massive heart attack and is just found dead at home over here in Lexington. And Breckinridge himself passed about the same age, 4 or 5 years later, of tuberculosis. There was a big tuberculosis outbreak in Kentucky in 1806, and he got caught up in it, and he passed away. And one of the last things he did was write Jefferson, "I'm trying my best to get back and help you." Because by this point, he was sort of, even though he was Attorney General, he would have a standing dinner. You can go back and look in the Breckinridge papers once a week with Jefferson. And Jefferson, you can find handwritten notes from Jefferson's aide. He said, "Why don't you come over tonight? We're going to have a good French meal." And he said, he'd always almost say, "I've got some legislation I've been writing. I want you to take a look at it." He reminds me of Governor Patton. He was always writing his own legislation. Jefferson, while he's president, he's writing bills left and right. And then Nicholas goes ahead and passes. That's the Kentucky Capitol that burned down. That's where the Alien Sedition Acts, the Kentucky resolutions were debated. There's Bob Stevens. Bob, you talk about a guy. I talked to some people that worked for Bob, and they said, oh, he loved trotting out Jefferson all the time. He used that every chance he got. He was on the court for 20 years. That's a great portrait of Jefferson. I think that's 4 years before he passed away. And an interesting thing about Jefferson, there are two things he wrote of any consequence that were lengthy just a couple years before he died. One of them was his autobiography, where he tells the story about how awful a meeting he had with George III. So I ended up putting some of this in the book. He went over there with John Adams to meet George III, and George III liked Adams. Adams was somewhat of an aristocrat and sophisticated, and even though he was a revolutionary. But Jefferson dressed rather plainly. He was tall, apparently very elegant. He'd written the Declaration of Independence, and King George III, in his autobiography, Jefferson said, just turned his back on him and made fun of him. Said something, basically said, all you care about is the French. And he intentionally, according to Jefferson, sort of pointedly had a nice conversation with Adams, but didn't pay Jefferson any mind at all. So he put that story in there, and I included some of that in the book to try to make sense of Jefferson's fascination with separation of powers. He really despised the monarchy. Some of the things he put in the Declaration of Independence had to be taken out because they were so strong. John Jay and Adams took them out. He blamed George III for enslavement. But that's, I wish it was color. I tried to get, the publisher is great. Thanks to History Press for printing the thing, but I wish I could have done some. But that's a fascinating portrait from life of Jefferson. And one other thing that he wrote of length just before he passed was a 15-page essay on Patrick Henry. And he sends Patrick Henry down the road. It's one of the roughest things you could ever imagine. If you ever want to find it, you can find it on Founders Online. And he says, Henry flunked the bar exam. And he said, back then, we had a committee of 3 people. And they re-voted on him. And the one person that didn't want Patrick Henry to be a member of the bar was George Wythe, the guy that had taught them all and that gave the closing speech at the ratification convention. And he gives Henry down the road. He says, you know what? I remember Henry when I was going to William and Mary, studying under Wythe. He said, I was 19 years old, and I had to go from my home and stay at these taverns on the way to William and Mary. In one of the taverns, the barkeeper was Patrick Henry. And he has not so good things to say about Henry, because he said, I'd see that guy all the time. And I knew he was going to be difficult. And he sure was. But that's something Jefferson decided to put on paper about Patrick Henry. There's some great biographies out about him, but my view of him, the more I read about him, he was a difficult fella. He certainly favored secessionism and Confederation of the States. That's a photo from a meeting we had of all the that's the second largest gathering of former governors in the history of the nation. There's one other one that Virginia had, and that's because Virginia was like us. They had term limits. We don't have term limits now. We have two terms. But that was, all of y'all know some of them in there. There's Julian Carroll and Governor Brown, and there's Louis Nunn down here in the corner. This whole meeting was about having a Kentucky Constitutional Convention. And Ned Breathitt was there, and Ned Breathitt said, you don't want to do that. He said, I went through that in the 60s. He said it was the biggest mess. Weatherby went through it. Happy Chandler thought about trying to get it done. And Kentucky has a complicated system to amend the Constitution. You have to put it on the ballot twice. You have to vote on it. It has to be published in all the newspapers. And so Kentucky tried that several times. We could never get it done. So Breathitt said, to heck with all that stuff. They came up with a Kentucky Constitutional Review Commission. It had the whole Supreme Court on it, all the members of the Senate and some other folks. And they intentionally had that thing propose a Constitution. The General Assembly passed it, and they immediately filed a lawsuit to see if it would hold up. The Supreme Court came up with an innovative, interesting opinion that said all that stuff in the Constitution doesn't matter. What matters is the will of the people, what's in the Bill of Rights. They hung their hat on Section 26 of the Bill of Rights that said let the people decide everything. The will of the people is in charge. So Breathitt, they put it on the ballot. And does anybody know what happened to it? It went down. It was 530 to 129,000. Everybody was against the new Constitution. And they'd cut it back to about 1/3 the length of the Constitution it is now. They got rid of all that old railroad and corporate stuff and all those different things that were in it. When you go look at it, it's a pretty efficient, nicely done document, but the public rejected it. And the thinking at the time, from what I've heard from folks, I remember Breathitt talked about it. He said that what amounts to CAICO, the counties were against it. They thought it hurt the counties, and it hurt the power of Kentucky's counties, which remain a big deal to this day. So we gave up on that, and I think the only thing that may have come out of that as far as the proposal, there were an awful lot of arguments, and the governor, who I saw about a year ago, I mentioned this to him, and he said, "You put that darn dinner in the book." He says, "That was one of the worst." He said, "I don't never want to go to another one of those things in my life." It was, the arguing was incredible. Louis Nunn got in an argument with Breathitt about the open housing law, and the governor had to, I remember Martha Lane Collins sat next to me, and she leaned over and she said, "Dennis, aren't you having a good time?" I said, "Governor, I'm just having the best time here with you." She said, "Let's just stay quiet and sit here." But this was in the parlor before the dinner. We're talking about having a Constitutional Convention. Never did it. I think we passed secession. Wasn't that on? Does anybody, John, remember next year? I think it was on 2002 or so. It was on the ballot. That's about the only thing that came out of it. You can only do 3 amendments to the Constitution per session. You don't want to see that. That's me on KET. There's one more slide, but I don't know where it was. The book's now available. I'll give you a free copy of it if you want one. That's about it. My head's full of more history, but I don't want to bore you. I thank you all for coming.
To take some questions.
Yeah, sure, if anybody has a question.
Some questions here.
All right, there may not be anything. If you don't have a question, it's okay. Yeah, oh, 2 questions. Yes.
Thomas Jefferson first came up with this separation of powers. Was there any other country that was trying to do something similar at the time? Did he have some guideline? No, just all ideas?
2 states had a similar provision, but it was much simpler, and it was just one sentence, and that's Massachusetts. And I think John Adams put that in there. But the Virginia Constitution had a very similar one-sentence statement on separation of powers. Jefferson was involved in that with a fellow named George Mason. Mason ended up being on the other side of everybody. He was with Patrick Henry at the Virginia Ratification Convention. There's a big home there in Virginia. I've been down to Gunston Hall. I'm going to look at some of his papers here in a few months for another book I'm writing on about that ratification convention. But there were 2 states that had it, but now I think it's about 8 states that have it. They all copied Kentucky's. Several of them have this bifurcated setup that we have. I think Nicholas just made a drafting decision to split it up, which our Kentucky Supreme Court thinks makes it the Kentucky Supreme Court calls it double-barreled and very important in the way it's structured. And that's why they tried it out, I think, all the time. But he just didn't want to go down the road that he feared we could go down if we didn't have some safeguards from one branch of government trying to exercise the power of the other. You got to remember what they were living through at the time and what mattered to them. You know, the revolution about it drained the country, drained us of money. And anything they could put in the founding document to emphasize those barriers between the branches, he thought was critical. And Madison was on the other side. Madison came around, though. See, Madison's called it mere words on parchment, but that was in 1787. And he's trying to get it right. He doesn't want the whole thing held up by a separation of powers clause. We've just been through the Constitution. So he's trying to get the Constitution ratified. Don't worry about that. But Madison knew everybody had a lot of respect for Jefferson, so he spent 6 pages going through the reasons why he didn't think that clause was necessary. Thank you.
Right here.
Can you tell us a little more about George Nicholas's importance to Kentucky?
His importance to Kentucky is that he was the point person. So the first day of the Constitutional Convention in Danville in 1792, he gets elected immediately, chair of a 3-person committee to draft the Constitution. He had in his pocket, in his hand, in the papers of Nicholas is a draft of the Constitution. There's a draft he wrote of the Virginia Constitution. So his importance, I think, to Kentucky is as the principal author of our first Constitution, as a fellow that really commanded the respect of our delegation, which was divided. You know, we had some fellow named John Fowler from Lexington voting. You'd recognize, if you go look at the folks that went to Virginia at that convention, Tripp, Crittenden, I mean, they're all, you know, folks that those of us been in Kentucky for a long time would recognize. And they're all over there right in the middle of it. And Kentucky just came along our way just at the last minute and came up with four people. But Nicholas is important. The thing about Nicholas, he had it, as I mentioned, about holding office. He could have probably been just about anything he wanted, if he wanted to do it. But he was contrary. Jefferson wrote a letter to somebody not long before Nicholas died. He said, Nicholas is brilliant, but he said he's excitable, and he's young and ardent, but he's just brilliant. And he got sideways on some business ventures down in the Caribbean late in life and lost some money. He made some of the money back, and he raised flax and hemp and corn. He wrote a letter to his brother Wilson Carey Nicholas, who was also at the age of 27. He was at that ratification convention. He said, you need to come to Kentucky and buy some land. He says, I'm never leaving this place. It's a beautiful, he said, I wish the food was a little better, and the politics is pretty rough, but he said, it's a great place to raise 8 kids. And he said, but before you come, don't do what I did. Make sure you come look at the property first before you buy it.
Where did he live?
Nicholas, he called he had an estate and a home down in Danville. He said that was his real home. He loved it, but he operated out of Lexington about half the time. He would split his time, and he passed away in Lexington. There's a monument to him over there. I think he's at the Presbyterian Cemetery. I don't know. Is it Episcopal? What's that one over there? I can't recall, but that's where he's. Yeah.
I was wondering, where could you do this? Would it be over at the old Capitol, or would it be at the second floor in the law library at the new Capitol, or would it be at
Where you can view what the
any of
any material. Well, you can now. I'll tell you where. If you want to have some fun, you can go online in Kentucky. The Lexington Public Library has the Kentucky Gazette's where I came across it. I would find references in Lowell Harrison's books, and then there was a professor at the University of Kentucky, Henry Dupre, who got me sort of interested in Nicholas after I found this. He's long since passed, but he wrote a big article in the Kentucky Historical Society Register on the politics of George Nicholas in 1941. That's where I kept seeing references to the Kentucky Gazette. And I thought, well, where is that? You're so fortunate today, you can find all this online. And that's where I found all those excerpts from the Kentucky Gazette. The Nicholas papers are online. Just Google it. It's fascinating. You just read The Creation of Kentucky, if you're interested in it. It's University of Chicago.
genealogy now? My family's been here since 1792.
What's your name? You mind if I ask? What's your maiden name? Or you?
Hey, I'm related to everybody here in Frankfort. Nathaniel Cook, who built the Good Shepherd, and also the Honorary, the Cook cabin, which was the last known
Yeah.
massacre in
Yeah.
Kentucky. We got a land grant, which is now Fort Stroke Farm, used to be Dennis Fleming. That's where
Yeah.
the massacre occurred.
Yeah.
That's like I'm Cook, William, Garrett, everybody's funeral home, Atkins.
Did you say Herod and Pulliam? You need to, y'all need, if you want to have some fun, go look at some of those minutes. Look at the 17, there were very few minutes of the first, there's just one summary document. But you see a lot of names, last names that you recognize from all over Kentucky. And they were right in the middle of it, creating the state. So it's kind of fun to see.
We were here before Kentucky was a state.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Going over this stuff, I never could imagine how much talk there was about Kentucky. George Washington, Madison, all of them were stirred up about, is Kentucky going to be with us, or should I move to Kentucky, or, you know. Breckinridge loved it. He was unlike Nicholas. He made 3 trips, and he stayed for 2-3 months at a time. And he went to northern Kentucky, he went to Louisville, went south of Louisville, he went to west Kentucky, and he kept coming back to central Kentucky. He said, that's the place. And he set up shop up here at what's Castleton Farms now, northeast of Lexington. And he stayed, but he made a lot of trips. Nicholas he was a quirky cat, but he more I read about him, If you ever want to look through his papers, there's a guy that's thinking all the time about how to put the Constitution together, and he could have had any job, but he pursued other things. Yeah.
Hi, sir. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for your service to our state.
Thank you for coming. I wouldn't have half my service if it wasn't for Ben Chandler over here. He put me in a spot to where I could learn about this stuff and appreciate it. Do you remember one thing? Remember that picture we showed up there of Thomas Jefferson? You can see that red hair? Ben Chandler and I, because Ben liked history too, one of the last things we did was go over to the Madison Library. And you remember that? We went over there, and Ben wanted to see some things about his grandfather, and we both agreed on something else. Wanted to see, I can't remember, it was Washington. We looked at Washington's diary and Theodore Roosevelt's. But when we first got there, they took us to a room, and the curator, it was a guy named Billington. He's dead now. He was the librarian of Congress, took us around. They brought out a big gray box, maybe lighter in color than this, about this size. And he opened the top of it, and there were 3 hair samples of Thomas Jefferson. Hair samples were a big deal back then. Taken by Martha Jefferson Randolph, his daughter, his favorite daughter. 3 weeks before he died, he wrote a letter. He said, I feel like I'm dying. The worst thing about it is I'm not going to be with my daughter anymore. And she took 3 hair samples from him when he was in his 50s, 60s, and when he died. And in every one of them, even in the last one, you could see it was gray, but there's still a little red in there. And when he was younger, he was a definite redhead with freckles, very light.
I would just like to ask if you or Mr. Chandler would have any advice for those of us who are just starting out in our public service journey.
I'll let Ben, just starting out. What would you, if you're interested in, do you interested in the law or being a lawyer? Remember, you don't have to be a lawyer to get involved in public service. I can tell you that. Well, I'll tell you what it is, regardless of whatever party you're in, if you're really interested in public service or even elective office, I would get involved in a campaign or in state government. And you don't want to, everybody, I want to work in the governor's office or I want to work for the lieutenant. Get out in one of the cabinets. Take whatever job you got and learn how government works. That's what I did. I was fortunate to be able to get a job in the economic development cabinet. And that opened up the whole, where I met John Gillen, Pat Abel, and some of these people and ran into them, and things just sort of fall into place. You got to listen to what yourself, though. Don't do something everybody else tells you to do. That's the worst thing you can do in life. If I've learned anything, you listen to yourself and what you want to achieve rather than have somebody else tell you what they think you should do, because then you won't be happy. But if you're interested in government, I would say volunteering. Would you agree, Ben? That's how I met people at a young age, and they'll notice you. You're energetic, and you'll end up moving along. That was the best opening. Then you develop some expertise, and you can move up and do things. It's very rewarding. I wouldn't say it's a place to make a lot of money, but I didn't care anything about that, really. Ended up doing okay, but I just would have been happy in state government. For me, it was a good experience. It has its challenges sometimes, but yeah, I would work in a campaign. Whether it doesn't matter if it's a local councilman or representative's campaign or governor's campaign. Try to get in the governor's campaign. Somebody has a chance to win. Because if you win and it's a close race, they'll remember you. If you were there when the chips were down. Yeah.
Do we have any other questions?
Thank you all.
If not, let's give Dennis another round of applause. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to hand the mic over to John to make a quick announcement here about our next lecture.
Thank you, Mr. Fleming, and thank you, Diane. Just wanted to let everybody know our next lecture is Dr. David Pollack, the director of the Kentucky Archaeological Survey, presenting on Frankfort's Forgotten Cemetery, which was uncovered in the late 90s when the transportation cabinet was built. So I encourage you all to come out for that. Thank you all so much for coming.
Oh, I have